Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we get started with the interview, if you haven't heard, I've started a Patreon account for the podcast. Patreon is a way for you to help support the show and get special rewards in return, such as a thank you shout out on the show and an enamel button with the Queer Spirit logo. This year, I've also added access to videos of the podcast interviews and a free monthly live virtual sound bath. If you'd like to join in supporting the show, just go to patreon.com/queerspirit. You can also find the link in the show notes. Any Patreon funds remaining after the basic production costs will be donated to nonprofits supporting diverse queer communities. Once again, that link is patreon.com/queerspirit. Thanks for your consideration. My guest today is Anthony Michael Lopez. Anthony is a queer disabled actor known for his appearances on Broad City, Homeland, and the feature film Mapplethorpe starring Matt Smith. He recently shared the stage with Daniel Craig, David Oyelowo, and Rachel Brosnahan in New York Theater Workshop's production of Othello. Anthony's new streaming miniseries Desert Inn, which premiered June 3rd on operabox.tv, is a supernatural story exploring queer love, loss, and the price of memories. Today, Anthony shares his journey as an actor and how his identities of being queer and disabled have shaped that path. We discuss the intersection of disability and queerness in media and how Anthony is working to bring more representation, especially in his latest project, Desert Inn. Lastly, we geek out on attachment theory, and Anthony shares how healing it has been to work with. Find Anthony on Instagram at Flittergaggot. That's FLITTERGAGGOT. Hi, Anthony. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here.
Yeah.
So I wondered if we could start out by having you share with us the story of how you first got interested in acting.
I think I've always been interested in it. I feel like I've always been called to do it and tell stories. I think I've found like the most healing and, life energy through storytelling. And I remember my mom telling me stories of being like 4 years old and watching Sesame Street and asking her to be one of the kids on Sesame Street. And she was like, well, you need an agent. And I said, well, get me an agent. So I've always wanted to do it. But then I started doing children's theater when I was about 10 years old. And I did it all through high school. I studied acting in college. And then right out of college, I started working professionally. And I basically haven't stopped. I took a little break intentionally, because there have been unintentional breaks too. But I took a little break when I was in my early 20s, because I was just sort of figuring out who I was and what I wanted to share and what I loved about acting, and just sort of taking time to like enter the real adult world. And then I moved to New York to just sort of explore, being an adult in 2010 and what that meant and who I was. And then acting just sort of found me again. And, one thing led to another. And then here I am. I've been, lucky enough to have a career now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. That's a really cute story about Sesame Street, wanting to be a kid on Sesame Street.
Just a little monster.
Uh-huh.
Get me an agent. She didn't, which I'm grateful for.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's obvious. Otherwise, you obviously would have been a shoo-in for Sesame Street, of course.
Duh. I mean, obviously.
I can see you having a little scene with Grover or Oscar the Grouch. So
I loved Grover. Oh my God. Grover was my favorite. And maybe I will. In fact, actually, the miniseries that I'm in now, Desert Inn, that's coming out on Thursday, one of the leads, Isabel Leonard, she's a big opera star. She had an episode on Sesame Street.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, recently. She's like living my childhood fantasy.
Very cool. We'll get to that in a second, but I want to just sort of introduce more of who you are to our listeners. So I know that you are pretty outspoken about your identity as a disabled person and about being queer and disabled as an actor. And I'm curious, as an actor, what that journey has been like for you to have both of those intersectional identities, in the world. And, I think that being queer is a lot more, actors are feeling more comfortable to be more out about that. But there's still not a lot of visibility of disabled people in the media, in movies and TV and the acting world. And I'm just curious how that journey has been for you.
Well, there is more visibility of queer actors, out queer actors now, but it's still a heavy bias against out queer performers. It's still hard for producers and sort of money people to wrap their heads around casting an out queer person, So there's still some friction there, but for me, it was never really like a question. There's a part of me that never questioned my place in the industry and my place as just as a performer, as a storyteller. And so there's that part of me that just never doubted it. And then there was another part of me that sort of was picking up on cues, I think, as all queer people do, and all people sort of on the margins. You pick up the cues that society is dropping you, that tell you that you don't belong, that you don't have a space.
Yeah.
So it's been about, for me, developing another voice to counteract that voice that's telling me that I can't do what I want to do, that I can't live the life that I want, because I don't really belong.
Yeah.
So that's been important to me. And also, just as someone with a disability, 26% of the population of the United States identifies as disabled. And yet, I think only like 8 or 9% of characters in the media in 2019 identified as disabled. And of that 8 or 9%, only about 2% were actually played by people with disabilities. So that sort of speaks to the mainstream culture's, I think, aversion to disability. There's even a debate about whether or not we want to call it disability. Some people are still too uncomfortable acknowledging that, this is like a group of people who identify by their physical limitations. People are still a little averse to physical limitation at all. So that's why I think it's really important to me. I get a lot of energy from thinking about just my appearance, my visibility in media being political and just showing up exactly as I am. I've got a prosthetic leg. I'm a right leg amputee. Just my image changes the conversation in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. As you were talking, I was also just making the connection when about what you were saying about wanting to be in Sesame Street. It reminds me that Sesame Street, they've, from my recollections of watching as a child, I don't know what it's like anymore, but that was probably one of the first places I saw like someone like a child on TV who had a disability. I think that they were pretty good for their time about showing stuff like that, showing a kid in a wheelchair or a kid with crutches or something like that. And yeah, I mean, when you reached out to me, I was thinking like, gosh, where else have I seen disability in the media, especially queer disability? And there's really not much. I mean, there's that new series that came out a couple of years ago, Special on Netflix with Ryan O'Connell. But that's really the only one I can think of.
Yeah. And my friend Ryan Haddad, who actually wrote this role for me in the miniseries, he is an out queer disabled actor. And he writes a lot of his own stuff, but he was also a recurring character on The Politician on Netflix, the Ryan Murphy show. So Ryan is out there doing this too. And we definitely need more of it. I mean, I just think about that disabled character on Sesame Street. I can imagine that character didn't exist when I was a kid. And I can't imagine the impact that it would have had on me to see another person, like a character in mainstream media with a disability where the disability wasn't their central problem, wasn't their whole identity, wasn't their disability. Because often I think still a lot of the auditions that I get are for characters whose main issue is that they are disabled, that they have physical limitations. So it doesn't really like a 3D human. It's someone who is reduced to, their main problem in life is that they're disabled, which is just it's not my experience, and it's not my disabled friends' experiences either.
Yeah. Is it hard when you go into auditions or anything like that for directors and producers to wrap their mind around casting someone who is disabled for a part for someone who just happens to be disabled?
I'm sure it's difficult. I'm sure there are varying levels of comfort, in the industry. I'm privileged enough that I can pass sometimes as non-disabled because I just like wear long pants and sort of try to walk a little bit more smoothly, smooth out the limp. So that's definitely a privilege that I acknowledge that, not a lot of that some other, disabled people don't have. But, like I was in a Disney commercial a couple of years ago, and they didn't know that I was disabled until I got to my costume fitting in Orlando, Florida, and it was hot and I was wearing shorts. And they were like, oh, we didn't realize that. And then, during the wardrobe fitting, they were dressing me in long pants. And then when they saw my leg, they started fitting me for shorts because they wanted to show it off.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an instance where I sort of my disability sort of snuck in the back door. And then they realized it could actually be an asset. It could actually help them. So there's a lot of possibility there. But I'm sure some people have a problem with it. I'm sure there are some people who, I'm sure there are some roles that I've lost because of it. Yeah. I know that like I've lost roles to other people who are even like less disabled than I am, who have less physical limitations where it's less obvious than it is with me. So, but I think that's like it's a motivator for me. It gives me energy to keep going and keep talking about this too.
Yeah. Well, I imagine that queer actors might have a similar experience of like, oh, well, they're more straight appearing, than this person got this role, even though they're also queer, but maybe they got it because they're less flamboyant or more straight appearing than I am or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. And it's like, especially in the media right now, we want to put people in boxes. It's a lot easier to look at someone, it's easier to sort of look at somebody and go, oh, I've seen that before.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than just sort of being open to whatever the person is and whatever expression they're taking on that day. And it's changing, it's growing, but we have to keep talking about this.
Yeah, it's a boulder we're continuing to push uphill.
Absolutely.
I'm curious about your role on Broad City, if they specifically were like, this is the joke that we're doing, and then they like sought out, someone with an amputee, leg amputee, or if they already knew you and they kind of wrote it for you, or what that was all about.
I wish I had never done any TV at that point. I really hadn't. That was literally my first TV appearance. And I just got an audition for a role called Leg Dude. And the scene it was already written. And I think they were sort of taking a risk with that. And then I wound up getting that part. And I think probably to this day, it's the thing that I'm most recognized for. It was a lot of fun. It was actually written to be just like 5 lines, like 4 or 5 lines. And then I got on set and Abby and I just started riffing and playing, and they kept all of it. They kept the whole scene in. They kept sort of everything that we did, and it just got more and more absurd every time we did it.
Can you describe the scene for our listeners who haven't seen it?
Oh, yeah. I'm sitting in a park in Madison Square Park in New York City, and Abby Jacobson comes up to me and asks for the chair that my right foot is resting on. And I say, I'm using the chair, you find another chair. And she says, well, we all wish we could use ottomans in the park, but there are a limited number of chairs. And she goes, and you're being a dick. And then we start to sort of fight. It gets heated. And then she rips the chair out from under my foot, and my prosthetic leg falls to the ground. And she immediately tries to fix the situation. And she tries to touch my prosthetic leg on the floor, and I tell her not to. And then she just sort of runs away. It's one of the most painful scenes on that show. And I think that's why it's so memorable.
So was a lot of that fight improv then?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And not just that, like the structure of the scene was always that we were going to get into a fight. She was going to pull the chair out and my leg was going to fall into the ground. But then what happened after was mostly improvised. The discomfort, her sort of groveling for me to forgive her.
Yeah. So Can you share with us about your latest project, which is just recently out online, Desert Inn?
Yeah. So it's being produced by the Boston Lyric Opera and Long Beach Opera. And it's a new form of operatic miniseries. So it sort of blends music video with opera with film. And it's a sort of mysterious, spooky dooky love story that takes place out in the desert where people can go to this hotel, Desert Inn, in the middle of the desert in California and reconnect with loved ones that they've lost. They can actually spend time with loved ones that they've lost. And through the course of the miniseries, you start to realize that the power that's holding all of this together comes from a sorceress who has not yet dealt with her own queer trauma. So this is a real, enticing opportunity to spend time with your loved ones, but it's all about control for her. And so when someone sort of tries to subvert her control, she doesn't react very kindly to that. So that's the main conflict of the story. And I play Federico, who is the maintenance person at the hotel. And one of the most challenging guests is played by Raviv Ullman. He plays Ion, and he comes to the hotel as a guest, as a living guest, and he sort of challenges the situation. And Ion and Federico, we sort of fall in love. And I realize I might not be as happy living at the hotel as I thought. So interesting things start to happen. You'll have to tune in and find out.
And did I understand correctly that each episode, the music is by a different composer?
Yeah, so we've had TV writers like Ryan Haddad, playwrights, like Christopher Oscar Pena and other, beautiful writers, and 8 different composers and several directors too.
And so does the music sound significantly different, or is it?
From episode to episode? Well, I haven't heard all of the music, but yeah, there are significantly different styles throughout the piece. Yeah. Yeah, but it comes out in 4 installments.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's the end of June. So most of them will be out already, and you'll be able to watch probably almost all of them.
Mm-hmm. And so going back to what we were talking about before, was this one of those roles that you just play a character who just happens to be disabled and it's not really part of it? Or was it something that they sought you out for?
This was an incredible opportunity. Yeah, because usually I do go out for roles whose, central problem is their disability. But in this, Federico's main, struggle is loss and grief and love and the desire to live like a full, free life.
Mm-hmm.
And he just happens to be disabled.
Mm-hmm.
And the disability is a part of the story, but it's not Federico's main focus. And it's not the other character's main focus when they're dealing with Federico.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's really beautiful. And actually, Ryan Haddad, who I mentioned before, he wrote this character with me in mind and then called me in April and just said, "Hey, do you want to do this thing? We're going to fly you out to the desert." And I was like, "Of course, like, hell yes. Like, I haven't done anything in a year. Of course I'm going to do this." So yeah, this is why, it's why it's so important to have disabled and queer artists on both sides of the camera. People writing and directing and composing as well as performing, because they really got it right. This comes from all of the collaborators' lived experiences. Mm-hmm. So people who know about the pain of being disabled in essentially ableist society, as well as people who know about queer pain and queer trauma in, a queer phobic society.
Yeah.
So really, like, this piece is really an oasis for outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
I said this, I keep thinking, like, man, if I had a story like Desert Inn, and if I had exposure to a character like Federico when I was a kid, I might have felt like there was more room for me in the world, that the world was more welcoming to me. And then maybe my life would have been just a little bit maybe easier.
Yeah.
So I hope this reaches the right people, and I hope it does make more space for marginalized people in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As you were saying, it's important to have queer and disabled people on both sides of the camera. It made me think about, or just wonder, what your experience is in terms of your queer identity or your identities disabled person, when you show up to a project or even before it starts, if the writer, the director, the producers don't have experience of a queer person or a disabled person, how much they may inquire to get that perspective, to get a little bit more, quote unquote, real. And I wonder if, in your experience, you've noticed if people feel more comfortable asking you about one or the other to get your input about your role or your character.
Well, I think with this piece, it's a little different because there wasn't a lot of interrogation that needed to happen. There wasn't a lot of learning that needed to happen. But with other things, so often as an actor, I'm just asked to show up and do the thing and then get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think with disability, because there are like practical accessibility issues that either the theater or the production would need to sort of, meet my accessibility needs, there's more conversation about that, but there's usually never any conversation about how to accommodate a queer space, and I'm not sure why. I mean, maybe because mostly these things are coming from super, heteronormative spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not a lot of that. And I just think it's kind of like a don't ask, don't tell kind of situation still in the industry. I mean, I did a show a few years ago and I didn't think twice about whether or not I was out as a gay man.
Mm-hmm.
I just was sort of doing me, like just being myself. And then toward the end of the production,
mm-hmm.
I had people come up to me and say like, wow, I'm so impressed with your openness about yourself, about being gay.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me by surprise because I was like, what? I was like, it's 2017. Like, is the expectation that actors should be in the closet?
Yeah.
Like, and maybe maybe that's true. Maybe I'm just being naive about it, but I just feel like it's important to be yourself, especially as an actor. I mean, we're showing up, we're artists. We're trying to share authentically. That's part of the beauty of it. It's like you're getting an authentic human experience. I can't imagine trying to act straight or to like butch up. Like that seems really stifling.
Yeah.
It's one thing if I'm doing it for the role, if the role is a more butch person,
mm-hmm.
then that's one thing. But like off camera or off stage, it doesn't make sense to me to hide.
Yeah. Well, thank you for not hiding.
You're welcome.
You don't have to say, but I'm curious if like where this production was, if it was in a smaller city or a more conservative area or.
It was in New York.
Oh, okay. Wow. So who knows? Yeah.
I think it is changing though.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've made strides in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
We've definitely made strides in the last few years. Queer people, as well as people of color, as well as disabled people, are being sought after.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's been a sea change.
Yeah. So with that same question, you kind of answered it from the perspective of yourself as Anthony, the actor, but I'm also curious if people ask you in terms of you, the actor, but also in terms of the character that you're playing, like if they would ever change something in the production, like ask your opinion, like if they don't know, like, oh, would you as a gay man do this? Or would you as a disabled person, would this character as a disabled person do this? If you've noticed a difference of them feeling more comfortable around that, in the same way they might ask, a person of color, like, would you as a person of color, if the director or the writer is white, say, does this make sense that we're having this character do this thing?
I think, of course, they should,
Mm-hmm.
They don't always, but also I think before I was coming from sort of a lack mindset and thinking, oh, I should just be grateful that I'm working at all. And I'm just going to try to do the best that I can and not try to rock the boat and whatever. But now I sort of feel like I owe it to myself and to the marginalized communities that I represent that to speak up if I see something that is not super accurately representative or is diminishing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important. And I'm learning that there's a compassionate, loving way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't have to feel like a fight.
Yeah.
It can feel like it can be an invitation to them. And so I've been feeling more comfortable bringing those kinds of things up. And I think ultimately it is my responsibility and I owe it to myself not to wait for them to ask me for input.
Yeah.
I think now I want to start to just sort of offer it.
Yeah. That they don't have to be offended by you ruining their vision or something like that.
Exactly. Exactly. And I don't have to be worried that they're going to see it that way.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, one thing I know that you post a lot about on social media is attachment theory. And, me being in the mental health field, I think it could be something interesting to just chat about for a few more minutes before we wrap up. But I'm curious to know how you got interested in attachment theory and how it's important to you.
Well, I first discovered attachment theory through the work of Thais Gibson. She's a Canadian psychotherapist, and she's got an online school. So I first discovered it through her, but I've been working with a great queer therapist for the last couple of years for individual therapy. And he's brought up, attachment style with me without ever really going into sort of detail about the theory. And so I just took it upon myself to take a test, figure out what my main attachment styles are, and then dive into the research on my own. And it has been the single most healing modality that I have ever worked with. I felt so identified. It gave me such a safe container to look at the parts of myself that I knew were insecure and were scared. And it just made me feel really safe to acknowledge those things about myself that I was not comfortable looking at before. And then it's also, I think part of this modality, which is really special about it to me, is it offers things to do to become more secure, to accept yourself and to approach yourself and other people with compassion and authenticity. And it's been huge for me. It's sort of changed my life. I feel like I have actual tools now to deal with my insecurities, whereas before I was just sort of trying to soothe them and sort of keep them to myself so that I didn't so I wasn't super reactive all the time. But now I realize that that approach was based in fear, and I don't have to be afraid of my insecurities. And that's something that I learned through working with attachment theory.
Would you like to describe in a nutshell what attachment theory is for our listeners?
Sure.
I figure it'd be better for you to do it than me because you'll probably give a less technical variation of it than I would. So.
Well, I would love to hear. Okay, I'll go first, but I would love to hear if anything that I'm saying is not how you understand it, because you are the mental health professional. But
okay,
the way I think of attachment theory, it's like a way of organizing and identifying different styles of attachment that are founded on mostly a spectrum of security and insecurity. So if someone, and how they deal with that in relationships. So there's avoidant attachment styles, dismissive attachment styles, and then disorganized attachment styles and secure attachment styles. And my understanding is that we've all got some balance of several different attachment styles that we sort of work from, and that those things sort of shift depending on the situation. And it just helps me sort of organize my, insecurities, I guess, the ways that I deal with relationships. Yeah. I've never described attachment style before, so that accounts for the clunkiness.
Well, you actually gave a more technical description than I was expecting, so that's good.
How would you describe it?
So I would say attachment theory is about, you could replace attachment with relationship for the most part. And so attachment theory comes from the idea of the way that we related or emotionally and psychologically attached, that's where the word attachment comes from, to our parents, or the way that they attached or related to us in a way. And that, if they attended our needs physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and how they did or did not attend our needs as a child growing up and the way that they related to us. And, growing up, for people who grew up in a traditional, father-mother household, the mother may have related to us differently than the father and that kind of thing. And that starts to unconsciously affect the way that we then relate to other people out in the world. But most predominantly the way we relate to other people in a romantic relationship. And so then what happens is the way that we were taught to relate or attach to other people based on the way our primary caretakers related to us, it then affects the way we relate to other people out in the world But those other people grew up in other households in other ways. And so then there can be sometimes conflict in terms of like, well, I'm doing this thing, so why aren't you doing this thing back to me in a kind of codependent way? And, we may have grown up in a household where there was not complete unconditional love, and we thought that we had to do this in order to get love, or we had to not do this in order to get love. And so we take that belief into ourselves unconsciously and we map that onto other relationships. And so when we get older and we get into romantic relationships, it can become complicated and confusing because other people grow up in other households where they have different attachment styles, which may not be compatible to ours. And so learning what your different attachment styles are in different situations with different kinds of people can help you figure out, how do I navigate this relationship and get my needs met? Am I avoidant? Am I insecure? Am I anxious? Or am I secure? Or in what ways do those different parts of me show up? And so, yeah, I think that working with a therapist, and there's lots of great books out there to really help you understand how that works. And there's a lot of books and people who do workshops and stuff like that, specifically around working with couples and relationships too.
It's also been really helpful for me in my professional relationships. The most helpful takeaway from working with attachment theory for me has been understanding that it's actually safe to tell people how I actually feel, that I can compassionately, lovingly share even uncomfortable feelings in certain situations with the people who I'm relating to.
Yeah. And I imagine that's really important as an actor. You're getting really intimate with people who you just met.
Absolutely. And I can't tell you, I've been in so many professional situations where I felt so insecure showing up. My imposter syndrome was just screaming, I'm not as famous as that person. I'm not as good as that person. I'm not as attractive as this one. And instead of addressing those messages inside of me, I was just trying to sort of stuff them away and push forward. And something that attachment theory has really helped me with, like a safer container to acknowledge those insecurities. And even in some cases, when it's appropriate, share them with other people, bring them out into the space. And so that just sort of frees me up to share authentically. And then it gives other people an opportunity to really see me. That was a function of my avoidance, not letting people really see who I am, because I was afraid that if they did see who I actually was, they wouldn't like it and they wouldn't love me. They wouldn't hire me back. They would abandon me. Then I would be at risk. I'd be in danger. So it was like a real primal fear.
And I think a lot of queer people just generally feel that way.
Absolutely. We've been given so many messages that we don't belong here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very easy for us to carry that belief with us wherever we go and act from it.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be scary if we ignore that too, if we ignore that belief and we sort of let it control us in a way, instead of really looking at it, really investigating it.
Do you ever apply the lens of attachment theory to your characters?
Yeah, I did for Desert Inn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because I could see how it could be really helpful if you think like, oh, I can imagine this person might have this kind of attachment style based on what I know or think, whatever the writer or director has told me the subtext or that kind of thing of this character is.
What's interesting? It's like once I started learning about it, I started seeing it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So I think even writers or directors or actors who don't know necessarily that they're talking about attachment theory, I've started to just notice the patterns. I'd watch like The Crown and be like, oh, Elizabeth is being very avoidant right now, so like that, yeah, I do see it everywhere. But mostly the way that it's useful to me as an actor is that it lets me accept myself and it frees me from, because I'll be on set and I'll be doing the job of acting. And then, in the past, I would also be doing like this other job the whole time of trying to stuff down my insecurities, trying to quiet my insecurities.
Mm-hmm.
So letting them sort of breathe frees me up to be creative and be in the moment.
Awesome. So Anthony, before I let you go, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
Absolutely. I thought about this one, and I really think for me, it's Alexander technique, which is a way of reconceptualizing the physical body to allow gravity to sort of structure how we move through the world. Because we tend to walk around with a lot of tension, a lot of extra tension that's unnecessary. And Alexander technique helps me to, it's like attachment theory. It helps me to relax into reality and to accept my body exactly as it is. And that's been very important, not only as a queer person, but as a disabled person as well.
And did you discover that as more for acting or more for just being in your body or a combination?
I heard about it through my acting training, but I didn't really start to work with it in a meaningful way until recently. In fact, I had a reading with the astrologer Eliza Einhorn, I think is her last name. She's Moon Pluto Astrology, and I highly recommend her. But she suggested to me in 2019 that I start working with an Alexander coach. She said alignment was going to be very important to me. And it was really important to me, and it helped me with some physical issues and also with some emotional stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know that a lot of people generally seek it out who do acting or dance or movement and that kind of thing, but it can also be a physical or even emotional therapeutic modality too. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, no, I find it really helpful for my emotional and psychological health too.
Great. So Anthony, where can people find you and Watch the Desert Inn online?
So I am Flittergaggett on Instagram. Heard of it? So yeah, it's at Flittergaggett, FLITTERGAGGOT. It's like glitter faggot, but can't say that. So that's me on Instagram. And then to watch Desert Inn, it's operabox.tv. It's a new streaming platform for the Boston Lyric Opera, but you don't need a subscription to watch it. You can pay per episode or it's a small amount. I think it's like $30 to watch the whole piece. That's operabox.tv.
Great. Well, I'll have those links in the show notes so people can also find them there.
Thank you very much.
Well, Anthony, it was a pleasure having you here and hearing more about what you're doing in the world. And thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.